The mask is the true subject of repetition. I do not repeat because I repress. I repress because I repeat. I forget because I repeat. I repress because I can live certain things or certain experiences only in the mode of repetition. I am determined to repress whatever would prevent me from living them thus, in particular, the representation which mediates the lived, by relating it to the form of a similar or identical object. Eros and Thanatos are distinguished in that Eros must be repeated, can be lived only through repetition, whereas Thanatos, as transcendental principle, is that which gives repetition to Eros, that which submits Eros to repetition. If repetition makes us ill, it also heals us. If it enchains and destroys us, it also frees us, testifying in both cases to its demonic power. We are not healed by simple anamnesis. The more theatrical and dramatic operation by which healing takes place, or does not take place, has a name: transference. Now, transference is still repetition. Above all, it is repetition. By signal, we mean a system with orders of disparate size, endowed with elements of dissymmetry. By sign, we mean what happens within such a system, what flashes across the intervals when a communication takes place between disparates. The sign is indeed an effect, but an effect with two aspects. In one of these, it expresses qua sign the productive dissymmetry. In the other, it tends to cancel it. The sign is not entirely of the order of the symbol. Nevertheless, it makes way for it by implying an internal difference, while leaving the conditions of its reproduction still external. There is an idea and a pure dynamism which creates a corresponding space. A bare material repetition of the same, appears only in the sense that another repetition is disguised within it, constituting it and constituting itself in disguising itself. Learning takes place not in the relation between a representation and an action, reproduction of the same, but in the relation between a sign and a response, encounter with the other. Signs involve heterogeneity in at least three ways. First, in the object which bears or emits them, and is necessarily on a different level, as though there were two orders of size or disparate realities, between which the sign flashes. Secondly, in themselves, since a sign envelops another object, within the limits of the object which bears it, and incarnates a natural or spiritual power, an idea. Finally, in the response they elicit, since the movement of the response does not resemble that of the sign. The movement of the swimmer does not resemble that of the wave. In particular, the movements of the swimming instructor which we reproduce on the sand bear no relation to the movements of the wave which we learn to deal with only by grasping the former in practice as signs. That is why it is so difficult to say how someone learns. There is an innate or acquired practical familiarity with signs, which means that there is something amorous, but also something fatal about all education. We learn nothing from those who say, "Do as I do." Our only teachers are those who tell us to do with me, and are able to emit signs to be developed in heterogeneity rather than propose gestures for us to reproduce. In other words, there is no ideomotivity, only sensory motivity. To learn is indeed to constitute this space of an encounter with signs, in which the distinctive points renew themselves in each other, and repetition takes shape while disguising itself. Signs are the true elements of theater. They testify to the spiritual and natural powers which act beneath the words, gestures, characters, and objects represented. They signify repetition as real movement, in opposition to representation, which is a false movement of the abstract. In every case, repetition is difference without a concept. The first repetition is a repetition of the same explained by the identity of the concept or representation. The second includes difference and includes itself in the alterity of the idea, in the heterogeneity of an A presentation. One is conjectural, the other categorical. One is repetition in the effect, the other in the cause. One is inanimate, the other spiritual. One is a bare repetition, the other a cupboard. There are four principal aspects to reason insofar as it is the medium of representation. Identity in the form of the undetermined concept, analogy in the relation between ultimate determinable concepts, opposition in the relation between determinations within concepts, resemblance in the determined object of the concept itself. These forms are like the four heads or the four shackles of mediation. Whereas specific difference is content to inscribe difference in the identity of the indeterminate concept in general. Generic, distributive, and hierarchical difference is content, in turn, to inscribe difference in the quasi-identity of the most general, determinable concepts, that is, in the analogy. Within judgment itself, the words everything is equal may therefore resound joyfully on condition that they are said of that which is not equal, in this equal univocal being. Equal being is immediately present in everything, without mediation or intermediary, even though things reside unequally in this equal being. Univocity of being also signifies equality of being. We must show not only how individuating difference differs in kind from specific difference, but primarily and above all, how individuation properly precedes matter and form, species and parts, and every other element of the constituted individual. That identity not be first, that it exist as a principle, but as a second principle, as a principle become, that it revolve around the different. Such would be the nature of a Copernican revolution, which opens up the possibility of difference having its own concept, rather than being maintained under the domination of a concept in general already understood as identical. Nietzsche meant nothing more than this by eternal return. Returning is the becoming identical of becoming itself. Returning is thus the only identity, but identity as a secondary power. The identity of difference, the identical which belongs to the different, or turns around the different. Eternal return is the univocity of being, the effective realization of that univocity. In the eternal return, univocal being is not only thought and even affirmed, but effectively realized. When representation discovers the infinite within itself, it no longer appears as organic representation, but as orgiastic representation. It discovers within itself the limits of the organized. Orgiastic representation has the ground as its principle, and the infinite as its element, by contrast with organic representation, which retains form as its principle and the finite as its element. Difference finds its own concept in the posited contradiction. It is here that it becomes pure, intrinsic, essential, qualitative, synthetic, and productive. Here that it no longer allows indifference to subsist. It is not difference which presupposes opposition, but opposition which presupposes difference. And far from resolving difference by tracing it back to a foundation, opposition betrays and distorts it. Our claim is not only that difference in itself is not already contradiction, but that it cannot be reduced or traced back to contradiction, since the latter is not more but less profound than difference. In its essence, difference is the object of affirmation, or affirmation itself. In its essence, affirmation is itself difference. In very general terms, we claim that there are two ways to appeal to necessary destructions that of the poet who speaks in the name of a creative power, capable of overturning all orders and representations in order to affirm difference in the state of permanent revolution, which characterizes eternal return, and that of the politician who is above all concerned to deny that which differs, so as to conserve or prolong an established historical order. For if eternal return is a circle, then difference is at the center, and the same is only on the periphery. It is a constantly decentered, continually tortuous circle, which revolves only around the unequal. Negation is difference, but difference seen from its underside, seen from below. Negation results from affirmation. This means that negation arises in the wake of affirmation or beside it, but only as the shadow of the more profound genetic element, of that power or will which engenders the affirmation and the difference in the affirmation. Movement, for its part, implies a plurality of centers, a superposition of perspectives, a tangle of points of view, a coexistence of moments, which essentially distort representation. The work of art leaves the domain of representation in order to become experience, transcendental empiricism or science of the sensible. Empiricism truly becomes transcendental and aesthetics, an apodictic discipline only when we apprehend directly, in the sensible, that which can only be sensed, the very being of the sensible, difference, potential difference, and difference in intensity as the reason behind qualitative diversity. It is always differences which resemble one another, which are analogous, opposed, or identical. Difference is behind everything, but behind difference there is nothing. Each difference passes through all the others. It must will itself, or find itself, through all the others. Nietzsche seems to have been the first to see that the death of God becomes effective only with the dissolution of the self. The task of modern philosophy has been defined to overturn Platonism. That this overturning should conserve many Platonic characteristics is not only inevitable, but desirable. It is true that Platonism already represents the subordination of difference to the powers of the one, the analogous, the similar, and even the negative. It is like an animal in the process of being tamed, whose final resistant movements bear witness better than they would in a state of freedom to a nature soon to be lost. The Heraclitean world still growls in Platonism. With Plato, the issue is still in doubt. Mediation has not yet found its ready-made movement. The idea is not yet the concept of an object which submits the world to the requirements of representation, but rather a brute presence which can be invoked in the world only in function of that which is not representable in things. The idea has therefore not chosen to relate difference to the identity of a concept in general. It has not given up hope of finding a pure concept of difference in itself. It is true that division is capricious, incoherent procedure, which jumps from one singularity to another by contrast with the supposed identity of a concept. Is this not its strength from the point of view of the idea? Far from being one dialectical procedure among others which must be completed or relayed by others, is not division the one which replaces all the other procedures from the moment it appears, and gathers up all the dialectical power in favor of a genuine philosophy of difference? Is it not simultaneously the measure of both Platonism and the possibility of overturning Platonism? Division is not the inverse of a generalization. It is not a determination of species. It is in no way a method of determining species, but one of selection. It is not a question of dividing a determinate genus into definite species, but of dividing a confused species into pure lines of descent, or selecting a pure line from material which is not. The search for gold provides the model for for this process of division. Difference is not between species, between two determinations of a genus. Pure difference, the pure concept of difference, not difference mediated with the concept in general, in the genus and the species. To participate means to have part in, to have after, to have in second place. What possesses in first place is the ground itself. Justice alone is just, says Plato. Laying claim is not one phenomenon among others, but the nature of every phenomenon. The ground is a test which permits claimants to participate in greater or lesser degree in the object of the claim. In this sense, the ground measures and makes the difference. We must therefore distinguish between justice, which is the ground, the quality of justice, which is the object of the claim possessed by that which grounds, and the just, who are the claimants, who participate unequally in the object. That is why the Neoplatonists provide us with such a profound understanding of Platonism in setting out their sacred triad, the imparticipable, the participated, and the participants. One could say the father, the daughter, and the suitor. If the true claimant, the first grounded, the well-grounded, the authentic, has rivals who are like parents, auxiliaries, or servants, all participating in his claim in various capacities, he also has simulacra, or counterfeits, who would be exposed by the test. Problematic structure is part of objects themselves, allowing them to be grasped as signs, just as the questioning or problematizing instance is part of knowledge, allowing its positivity and its specificity to be grasped in the art of learning. More profoundly still, being, what Plato calls the idea, corresponds, quote-unquote, to the essence of the problem or the question as such. It is as though there were an opening, a gap, an ontological fold which relates being and the question to one another. In this relation, being is difference itself. Being is also non-being, but non-being is not the being of the negative. Rather, it is the being of the problematic, the being of problem and question. Difference is not the negative, on the contrary, non-being is difference. This non-being is the differential element, in which affirmation as multiple affirmation finds the principle of its genesis. The Heideggerian not refers not to the negative in being, but to being as difference. It refers not to negation, but to questioning. It seems that Heidegger's theses may be summarized as follows. 1. The not expresses not the negative, but the difference between being and being. 2. This difference is not between in the ordinary sense of the word. It is the fold. It is constitutive of being in the manner in which being constitutes being, in the double movement of clearing and veiling. Being is truly the differentiator, with a C, of difference. Whence the expression ontological difference. 3. Ontological difference corresponds to questioning. It is the being of questions, which become problems marking out the determinant fields of existence. 4. Understood in this manner, difference is not an object of representation. As the element of metaphysics, representation subordinates difference to identity, if only in relating it to a third term as the center of a comparison between two supposedly different terms, being and being. Heidegger recognizes that this point of view of metaphysical representation is still present in the essence of reasons. But metaphysics is unable to think difference in itself, or the importance of that which separates as much as of that which unites, the differentiator, with a C. There is no synthesis, mediation, or reconciling in difference, but rather a stubborn differentiation, with a C. This is the turning beyond metaphysics. Being itself can open out in its truth the difference of being and being preserved in itself only when the difference explicitly takes place. That was a quote. 5. Difference cannot therefore be subordinated to the identical or the equal, but must be thought as the same in the same. The same never coincides with the equal, not even in the empty indifference oneness of what is merely identical. We regard as fundamental this correspondence between difference and questioning, between ontological difference and the being of the question. Does Heidegger conceive of being in such a manner that it will be truly disengaged from any subordination in relation to the identity of representation? It would seem not, given his critique of the Nietzschean eternal return. Overturning Platonism then means denying the primacy of original over copy, of model over image, glorifying the reign of simulacra and reflections. When eternal return is the power of formless being, the simulacrum is the true character or form, the being, of that which is. The simulacrum and the symbol are one. In other words, the simulacrum is the sign, insofar as the sign interiorizes the conditions of its own repetition. The simulacrum seizes upon a constituent disparity in the thing from which it strips the rank of model. Eternal return, affirmed in all its power, allows no installation of a foundation ground. On the contrary, it swallows up or destroys every ground which would function as an instance responsible for the difference between the original and the derived, between things and simulacra. Everything, animal or being, assumes the status of simulacrum, so that the thinker of eternal return, who indeed refuses to be drawn out of the cave, finding instead another cave beyond, always another in which to hide, can rightly say that he is himself burdened with the superior form of everything that is like the poet, burdened with humanity, even that of the animals. Plato gave the establishment of difference as the supreme goal of the dialectic. However, difference does not lie between things and simulacra, models and copies. Things are simulacra themselves. Simulacra are the superior forms, and the difficulty facing everything is to become its own simulacrum, to attain the status of a sign in the coherence of the eternal return. The simulacrum is the instance which includes a difference within itself, such as at least two divergent series on which it plays, all resemblance abolished, so that one can no longer point to the existence of an original and a copy. The past and the future do not designate instants distinct from a supposed present instant, but rather the dimensions of the present itself, insofar as it is a contraction of instants. The living present goes from the past to the future, which it constitutes in time, which is to say also, from the particular to the general, from the particulars which it envelops, by contraction to the general, which it develops in the field of its expectation. The difference produced in the mind is generality itself, insofar as it forms a living rule for the future. In any case, this synthesis must be given a name, passive synthesis. Although it is constitutive, it is not, for all that, active. It is not carried out by the mind, but occurs in the mind, which contemplates prior to all memory and all reflection. Passive synthesis, or contraction, is essentially asymmetrical. It goes from the past to the future in the present, thus from the particular to the general, thereby imparting direction to the arrow of time. The active syntheses of memory and understanding are superimposed upon and supported by the passive synthesis of the imagination. The constitution of repetition already implies three instances: the in itself, which causes it to disappear as it appears, leaving it unthinkable; the for itself of the passive synthesis, and grounded upon the latter, the reflected representation of a for us in the active syntheses. One refers to a closed repetition, the other to an open one. One refers to a repetition of elements of the type A. Tick, 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 tick. the other to a repetition of cases, such as AB, 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 tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. The principal distinction between these two forms rests upon the fact that in the second case, difference not only appears in the contraction of the elements in general, but also occurs in each particular case between two elements which are both determined and joined together by a relation of opposition. Repetition finds itself enclosed in the case reduced to the pair, while a new infinity opens up in the form of the repetition of the cases themselves. Every organism in its receptive and perceptual elements, but also in its viscera, is a sum of contractions, of retentions and expectations. At the level of this primary vital sensibility, the lived present constitutes a past and a future in time. Need is the manner in which this future appears as the organic form of expectation. The retained past appears in the form of cellular heredity. Furthermore, by combining with the perceptual syntheses built upon them, these organic syntheses are redeployed in the active syntheses of a psycho-organic memory and intelligence, instinct, and learning. All this forms a rich domain of signs, which always envelop heterogeneous elements and animate behavior. Each contraction, each passive synthesis constitutes a sign, which is interpreted or deployed in active syntheses. Habit draws something new from repetition, namely difference, in the first instance understood as generality. In essence, habit is contraction. But contraction also refers to the fusion of successive tick-tocks in a contemplative soul. Passive synthesis is of the latter kind. It constitutes our habit of living, our expectation that it will continue. We do not contemplate ourselves, but we exist only in contemplating, that is to say, in contracting that form from which we come. Underneath the self which acts are little selves which contemplate and which render possible both the action and the active subject. We speak of ourself only in virtue of these thousands of little witnesses which contemplate within us. It is always a third party who says me. The role of the imagination or the mind which contemplates in its multiple and fragmented states is to draw something new from repetition, to draw difference from it. For that matter, repetition is itself in essence imaginary, since the imagination alone here forms the moment of the vis repetitiva from the point of view of constitution. True repetition takes place in the imagination. Signs, as we have defined them as habitudes or contractions, referring to one another, always belong to the present. Natural signs are signs founded upon passive synthesis. They are signs of the present, referring to the present in which they signify. Artificial signs, by contrast, are those which refer to the past or the future as distinct dimensions of the present, dimensions on which the present might in turn depend. Artificial signs imply active syntheses, that is to say, the passage from spontaneous imagination to the active faculties of reflective representation, memory, and intelligence. The first synthesis of time constitutes time as a present, but a present which passes. The first synthesis is of habit, which is truly the foundation of time. But we must distinguish the foundation from the ground. The foundation concerns the soil. It shows how something is established upon this soil, how it occupies and possesses it, whereas the ground comes rather from the sky. It goes from the summit to the foundations and measures the possessor and the soil against one another. According to a title of ownership, habit is the foundation of time. It is memory that grounds time. Habit is the originary synthesis of time which constitutes the life of the passing present. Memory is the fundamental synthesis of time which constitutes the being of the past, that which causes the present to pass. Active synthesis has two correlative, albeit non-symmetrical aspects: reproduction and reflection, remembrance and recognition, memory and understanding. The active synthesis of memory may be regarded as the principle of representation under the double aspect: reproduction of the former present and reflection of the present present. The passive synthesis of habit constituted time as a contraction of instants with respect to a present, but the active synthesis of memory constitutes it as the embedding of presents themselves. The first paradox: the contemporaneity of the past with the present that it was. A second paradox: the paradox of coexistence. If each past is contemporaneous with the present that it was, then all of the past coexists with a new present in relation to which is now past. The Bergsonian idea that each present is only the entire past in its most contracted form. The past, far from being a dimension of time, is the synthesis of all time, of which the present and the future are only dimensions. We cannot say that it was. It no longer exists. It does not exist, but it insists. It consists. It is. It is. It insists with the former present. It consists with the new or present present. It is the in itself of time, as the final ground of the passage of time. In this sense, it forms a pure, general, a priori element of all time. There is thus a substantial temporal element, the past which was never present, playing the role of ground. This is not itself represented. It is always the former or present which is represented. Destiny never consists in a step-by-step deterministic relations between presents which succeed one another according to the order of represented time. Rather, it implies between successive presents, non-localizable connections, actions at a distance, systems of replay, resonance, and echoes, objective chances, signs, signals, and roles which transcend spatial locations and temporal successions. We say of successive presents, which express a destiny, that they always play out the same thing, the same story, but at different levels. Here more or less relaxed, there more or less contracted. This is why destiny accords so badly with determinism, but so well with freedom. Freedom lies in choosing the levels. What we live empirically as a succession of different presents, from the point of view of active synthesis, is also the ever-increasing coexistence of levels of the past within passive synthesis. Since each is a passing present, one life may replay another at a different level, as if the philosopher and the pig, the criminal and the saint played out the same past at different levels of a gigantic cone. This is what we call metempsychosis. Between the two repetitions, the material and the spiritual, there is a vast difference. The former is a repetition of successive independent elements or instants. The latter is a repetition of the whole on diverse coexisting levels. One is actual, the other virtual. It is always eros, the noumenon, which allows us to penetrate this pure past in itself, this virginal repetition, which is mnemosine. I is another, or the paradox of inner sense. The activity of thought applies to a receptive being, to a passive subject, which represents that activity to itself, rather than enacts it, which experiences its effect rather than initiates it, and which lives it like an other within itself. The ideas, nonetheless, remain the ground on which the successive presents are organized into the circle of time, so that the pure